Chapter 16. It's going to be tough here. When we heard that arrangements have been made for the cadre's children to go to school at the Changling No. 4 Middle School in Guangling Prefecture, Father and I were overjoyed. It hadn't been almost 3 years since I had graduated from the 3 Mile Primary School, and now, at 15, I was eager to renew my studies. Granted, I would now be receiving a revolutionary education, as provided for in the Cultural Revolution's educational reforms, but at least I wouldn't be spending all my time bent over in the fields. People say the town was like a country Shanghai, with shops, a post office, a bus stop, a clinic, and occasional movies and theatrical performances. To me, the idea of living there was a reprieve arranged by fate. So it was in good spirits that I wrapped my few belongings in a bedroll and walked the 8 li to school. It was a simple cluster of dirty buildings within a walled compound, the typical red star over the gate. A group of boys were playing a game of after-school basketball, and I felt a rush of happiness at the thought that now I would be able to join the activities that had once given me so much pleasure. I walked up eagerly to ask where I could find the school office. To my surprise, the boys drew back suddenly, and none of them would answer my question. It wasn't until I had repeated it for the 3rd time that one of the youngest pointed silently to the front building. I was no more than a few yards on my way when I heard behind me the familiar words that struck more fear in my heart than any others. I had believed I would never hear them again. Stinking intellectual son, 5 black type. Then, distinctly, I heard the sounds of 6 throats collecting spittle and depositing it wetly in the dust. A teacher showed me to my narrow wooden bunk bed, one of more than 50 in the single room that was the boys' dormitory. The boy sitting on the bed below mine was little Wu, the son of the Provincial Communist Youth League Party vice secretary. He had a big round head and sun-dark skin, and he greeted me happily. We knew each other rather well since his family had been sent to the adjoining No. 8 production team. He explained the situation. The students at this school had passed level upon level of political tests to be permitted to attend, getting approved from their brigades, their communes, and the town itself. All of them were the children of poor and lower middle peasants, so it was no wonder they were suspicious of us. And if their superb revolutionary backgrounds didn't make things difficult enough, the school revolutionary committee had told them that we new students were sons and daughters of cadres who had made serious mistakes in the city. We were coming to school for re-education. They were to supervise us and criticize us, but to avoid becoming friends with us at all costs, lest we contaminate them with our bad thought. Even in the dormitory, we were segregated. We 12 boys were all to be together in the 6 bunk beds, set a little away from the rest. Little Wu sighed. It's going to be tough here, really tough, maybe even worse than in Changsha. This was hard for me to believe, coming as I did from a production team where our relationship with the peasants were so good. But it was true. The peasant students jostled us when we stood in line to fetch hot water for washing. They mocked us as city dogs when they saw the soft, patch-free cotton gym pants we slept in. My disappointment was so sharp that I could hardly sleep that night. It was like sleeping in a room full of enemies. Things got worse over time, and the fact that, as resettled cadres family members, we received 3 meals of rice didn't help. The peasant children came back every Sunday night carrying their week's worth of sweet potatoes and their jars of salted peppers on their shoulder poles. Before each meal, they filled their metal bowls with 3 or 4 tubers and turned them over to the dining hall workers to be steamed. When the huge wooden crate opened and released its cloying sweetness into the air, they snatched their own bowls and hid away to eat their meals as if they were starving. But we lined up somewhere else entirely, at the teacher's window, handing over the coupons that symbolize the huge gulf between our worlds and receiving our fluffy white rice. Of course, at only 3 liang a meal, about a bowl, we were still ravenous. The peasant children also hated us because our grades were so much better than theirs. After our training in the city schools, we quickly memorized the simple political texts and sat bored through the elementary math and physics lessons. We even showed better coordination in gym and in our revolutionary performance classes. But there was never any homework and we had no books to read, so after school let out at 2 o'clock, we were equals in idleness. All this contributed to making us little better than wild creatures. Most of us cadre students already had substantial street knowledge, and our classmates' persecution and our hungry bellies forced us to use it. Although the girls tended to suffer in silence, we boys were a gang before we realized it. Our first adventures were at the farmers' markets, now tightly controlled by the government for the sale of collectively produced goods, but still crowded and lively. Production team representatives came from miles around to sell everything from rapeseed oil to dog meat to snakes, and the local officials walked about importantly, checking credentials and collecting taxes. At the height of the day, there were performances of Jiang Qing's model operas. We loved them, as we loved the chance to supplement our miserable diets. We had our techniques down to perfect. A group of us would approach some poor vendor, and someone would haggle with him about the prices until he was blind with fury and had lost his usual vigilance. Then the rest of us went into action. Preserved eggs disappeared into eager pockets, and peanuts vanished in greedy fistfuls. We were never caught. We were much too experienced for that. To us, stealing wasn't a moral question, but a question of survival. It was too easy, and we were too hungry, so we started to go out at night as well. After the dormitory was quiet, the 12 of us picked our way through the complicated structure of intersecting beds, where our 40 classmates lay near naked and snoring. Headed for the sweet potato fields, we ran silently into the night, trained now to use the moon shining in the rice paddies as our torchlight. We went farther each time to fresher and safer territory, recognizing the potato plants by the dew glittering on their tangled leaves. Even today, I want to cry when I think about that life, how I wriggled down between the rows, nearly burying myself, and scrabbled in the earth with my fingers until I felt a hard tuber. Fear and barking dogs made me greedy. I wiped off as much dirt as I could and devoured the potatoes raw. Right then, as I laid there on my stomach with the clinging earth grinding like metal in my teeth, the pulp tough, juicy, and bittersweet, creating revolutions in my belly. It wasn't until we were nearly sick that we filled up the extra pair of pants we had made into a sack by tying the ankles with strings, always urging each other, that's enough, in our terror of being discovered. Then we hoisted our loot around someone's neck, the crotch at his nape, and he let the run back, anchoring the elastic buttons in his hands, gliding with those little, even paces we had learned from the peasants. We still had to hide our plunder in the back of the deserted storeroom, where it would stay until we pretended to have bought it the next market day. And we had to wash ourselves in the pond, our splashing setting off all the dogs in the town. It was often near dawn by the time we lay back in our beds, our swollen bellies already aching and cramping with their strange burden. I was grateful many times over for the precious mosquito netting that had hidden my absence. Our classmates brought back word from their production teams that there was an infestation of wild pigs around that year. In a sense, I reflected sadly, they were right. I was particularly wretched during that time because I still had no family. My father was away and my stepmother was indifferent to me. I did not know whether she didn't know how to take care of me or didn't want to, but when I went home on a Sunday, she didn't even leave any rice for me if I went out onto the fields to work. So I often stayed alone in school, lying all day on my straw bedding. I cried a lot. During the days, I was very fierce, but at night, when I was alone, I cried soundlessly into my pillow. Gradually, the peasants in the production team came to notice the way Zhu treated me and gossiped about it in the fields in their good-hearted way. Guo Lucky Wealth and his wife were especially kind to me during my vacations and often shared their few sweet potatoes with me. Finally, I just gave them my rice coupons and the 12 yuan monthly allowance I had from father, and the relationship became official. I moved my bed out of the kitchen and into their part of the house, where they cared for me like their own son. Guo Lucky Wealth's wife's hands were very busy from the moment she woke up to the moment she went to bed. It was through living with her that I learned to have compassion for peasant women. Not only did she have to work with the men in the fields and for fewer work points, but she was also responsible for the hundreds of household tasks: hauling water from the pound, washing vegetables for pig and human food, feeding the fire with brushwood, cooking, scrubbing clothing, repairing the grass roof when it leaked, spinning thread from cotton for mending, and cleaning the kitchen so that not even a fly could feed itself in it. Although she was still young, her hands were rough and cracked like old boards, and her bare feet were much larger than father's. She wore her hair in 2 shining black braids, and her coarse round face reflected the humor that was her only answer to her misery. Life was a burden that she accepted and bore patiently, loving to talk about its sorrows as she smiled through her own sad words. Her great tragedy was that she was barren. The couple had no children to share the work, add to the family work points, and take care of them when they were old. Guo Lucky Wealth's wife talked about this constantly, and soon I had memorized the story. It seemed that a movie had been shown at the brigade soon after their marriage, illustrating the life of a young communist heroine. Afterward, Brigade Leader Li told all the women that they should learn from her, a childless woman of more than 30. During the next few weeks, barefoot doctors would visit every home to insert intrauterine devices. Guo Lucky Wealth's wife had been so inspired by the film that she consented to the procedure, but afterward she found herself so racked with pain that she could hardly go to the fields to work. Perhaps, she said, it was because the doctor was inexperienced, having been trained for only half a year. It was women's misfortune that men couldn't risk birth control because they were the main labor force. The commune clinic had refused to remove the IUD because of its family planning campaign, so she had been forced to turn into a woman who made a business of doing such things illegally, for a price of a few eggs. This woman had performed the operation with a wire bent into a hook, but had made a wreck of both her uterus and her bladder, so that now she had to wear cotton pads to absorb the constant flow of urine, laying them out in the sun to dry when they became saturated and had to be exchanged for another. "Aya," she often said, smiling at her own folly. "I should never have gone to see the free movie." I suggested many times that we save some money for her to see a doctor, but she said it was useless. She was already in debt to the team because of doctors. She said, "The only person who can help me is the witch doctor." But they're all afraid to come now because of the propaganda team. Then, one rainy day when we were all at home, a small child came running with the word that the witch doctor was coming. We saw her coming up the road under her leaky umbrella, an old woman, gray-haired with triangular sightless eyes, and headache medicine stuck to her temples with black paper. She began her muttering when she entered the room, her plump assistant at her heels. "This village is full of ghosts and demons in every house." Guo Lucky Wealth's wife ran immediately to a ceramic jar under the wardrobe and brought out 5 eggs, a usual price, babbling out the history of her complaint as quickly as she could. Meanwhile, I had 3 jiao in my pocket, and I quickly resolved to have my fortune told. I have been buffeted about too long by circumstance not to believe in fate. First, the blind witch doctor took a stick of incense from her bag and stuck it unerringly in a crack in the wall. She had Guo Lucky Wealth's wife lie in bed and burned paper money on the damp earthen floor. A preliminary attempt to buy off the ghost. The plump assistant had disappeared to find a branch from a peach tree, that potent anti-ghost weapon that can also be dangerous if you sit under it too long in the springtime, and returned with a healthy sprig. Many peasants were crowded into the doorway now, staring with curious, frightened eyes. I had never seen anything so impressive. The old blind women danced about the room, and chanting and threatening, using the peach tree branch as a sword to strike out the invisible ghost. The ghost was clearly struggling bravely, and the assistant presented its moans and taunts for the audience's benefit. The 2 women sang a kind of litany of attack and retreat. "Where are you?" "Here I am." "You have to go now." A slash of the branch. "But I haven't had my supper yet." Groan. This went on for about 15 minutes as Guo Lucky Wealth's wife lay sweating and terrified in her bed, submitting to the lashes, even those that fell on her face, as if she didn't feel them. At last, the witch doctor announced in despair, "The ghost won't leave," and her ghost assistant crackled in triumphant confirmation. Guo Lucky Wealth's wife burst into tears. "It wants to eat something, maybe 4 more eggs, and then it will go," continued the old woman. "I've never seen such an evil ghost." Guo Lucky Wealth's wife turned to look at her husband in mute appeal, and he bent down once again to the ceramic jar. There were only 2 eggs. "I have money," I cried. "I can give it 2 jiao." The old woman grinned delightedly. "Money works even better than eggs, with ghosts," she said. And she ran to the kitchen, once again unerringly, and picked up 2 cleavers. She swung these through the air by the bed, jumping and whirling as if being attacked on all sides. Then she paused, apparently victorious, and the ghost whimpered, I'm going. Don't beat me anymore." The old woman fumbled in her bag and brought out a glass bottle full of clear liquid. "This is the bottle of the immortals," she announced, sprinkling it around the room and on Guo Lucky Wealth's wife, who seemed to have fainted away. "Now the demon won't dare to come back, but you tell the sick woman not to have a drop to drink for 3 days, or she'll break the charm and ruin all our work. Now," she sighed and waved her arms as if to feel out new ghosts. "Who's next?" Everyone had crowded into the room to catch a drop of the water of the immortals, and the old women did a brisk business. There were no more exorcisms, but many, like myself, wanted their fortunes told. It was more than an hour before my turn came. The witch doctor had me sit down on the stool in front of her and placed her ice-cold hands on my face. I shivered all over, remembering that these hands had grappled with ghosts, but I kept my wits enough to answer that I was born in the morning and in the year of the horse. "You are about 15 years old," she crooned, "and your family is scattered north, south, east, and west. You are now in the sea of bitterness. Your 2 older sisters, your parents, and yourself, but this is the worst time. Many people have tried to harm you and will continue to do so in the future, but when you are about 20, you will be very lucky. People may try to keep you from enjoying this luck, but they will only partially succeed. As for your father," she frowned and her cold hands tightened on my face, "it will be many, many years before he leaves the bitter sea." I thought all this was astoundingly accurate and well worth a jowl. I waited for years for the truth of her predictions to reveal itself, anticipation of my good luck a continuous consolation. But Guo Lucky Wealth's wife's experience did not end so happily. It was true she stopped urinating during the days she didn't drink anything, but the water came again immediately afterwards. I was so thirsty that I began again too early, she wailed, holding her wet pants and weeping. It was nearly Spring Festival, the Lunar New Year, February 1970. My classmates had gone home and I slept alone in the damp dormitory, waiting to meet my sister Liang Weiping at the bus station and take her to our production team. Her leaders in Yuanjiang County, near Dongting Lake, had granted her a week's leave. I hadn't seen her in more than a year, and I hardly recognized the sweet potato puffy young woman who got off the bus. Her girlish braids were gone and her hair was short now, like a peasant's. Perhaps she no longer had time to comb out her hair, or perhaps, like me, she had discovered that in the countryside no one washes his hair except, incidentally, while swimming during the summer. She was wearing the same baggy blue clothes that she had on when she left, but they seemed tight and they were patched. She looked much older than her 17 years. I was overjoyed to see her, but even happier to see 2 long, dense loaves of glutinous rice in a basket hanging from the pole on her shoulder. Years later, she reminded how I begged her to break off a piece, and then crouched down by the road and devoured it ravenously, washing it down with ditch water. She described how she had cried as she watched me, squatting there in my rags, stomach distended, but the fine winter sleet must have hidden her tears, for I had no memory of them. Zhu Zhidao was in the kitchen by the fire when we arrived several hours later. The paths had been slippery because of the weather, and our feet ached from being clenched up inside our torn army sneakers. It was the only way to get enough traction to keep from falling. Our stepmother acknowledged us only when she saw Liang Weiping's long rice balbas. But then she smiled and got up slowly to fetch the hot water thermos and a basin for us to soothe our feet. Guo Lucky Wealth and his wife were more hospitable, and news of Liang Weiping's arrival spread quickly. The peasants commented on how pretty she was, and many of them urged her to visit their homes. Most of all, they were interested in hearing about conditions in the team where she lived, such as the value of a work point, 7 or 8 times its worth in our team, and the yield of a mu of land, about 0.16 acre. When she talked about the problems of fertilizers and preparing pig slop, she sounded just like an experienced peasant. Liang Weiping had always been generous, and she divided one of her long babas among her many hosts, ignoring Zhu Zhidao's admonishing frowns. The peasants now accepted her completely. It was from them she learned about how Zhu Zhidao had treated me, and she told me angrily that she had her own grievances as well. She had begged for 5 yuan a month for oil and salt and been refused. Although Auntie Zhu was kind enough to father, she just didn't see us as her own children. Once I even overheard Liang Weiping ask her for sanitary paper for her monthly. She was told to use old newspaper instead. Things were better after father came home because Zhu Zhidao seemed more cheerful. Father looked older now, with a hint of a shuffle in his walk. At first, I thought he was just weighted down with coats, for he was wearing everything he owned. He glued himself to the fire, however, and continued to shiver. We learned he had been sleeping on floors with only rice straw between himself and the damp earth, and had been rheumatic for several months. Spring Festival festivities were disappointing. Despite government decrees, there were a few firecrackers from midnight for the first day of the new year. A fruitless show of hospitality for a deaf Buddha of wealth. Like father, the cadres from the propaganda team had gone home and didn't care about what the peasants did. There were no feasts for anyone, though, and for Liang Weiping and me, none of the traditional treats given by parents to their children. Only a few kernels of popcorn tossed at us by an impatient Zhu Zhidao. However, for me, the wonderful thing about Spring Festival was the chance to exchange experiences with Liang Weiping. The one trait that all of us Liang children seemed to have inherited from father was a love of storytelling, and we listened to each other until late in the night, sitting in the kitchen by the embers so we wouldn't disturb anyone. My second sister had been luckier than Liang Fang in that she had signed up to go to Yuanjiang County with a group of classmates, one of them her best friend, Peng Ming's sister, expecting to be able to scoop fish out of the lake with a spoon. They were astounded to find themselves in what looked in cold December like the middle of nowhere. Since they were the only girls in the first group, the Grass Trail commune has assigned them to the production team nearest town. The county government educated youth office had given the local leaders 240 yuan for each of them so they could build them a house and 100 yuan for basic necessities. They were also to get 30 liang of rice per month while they earned their first work points. So at first, it looked as if their situation was going to be all right. It was a kind of glorious adventure, their first time to set up house on their own. What they hadn't counted on were the hard conditions, the differences in customs, and their own homesickness. What surprised Liang Weiping the most was the peasant's stinginess. She had been told every peasant would treat her like his own daughter, but instead they begrudged even an egg. Still, they were honest, hardworking, and basically good-hearted, as Liang Weiping discovered when she plucked up valuable wheat thinking it was grass. The peasants merely laughed and didn't ask her to pay. Liang Weiping told me a number of stories, such as about how one of the educated youths who went to the countryside with her ended up marrying a peasant boy. When they first arrived, the students were each assigned to live in a peasant home. This girl was given a bed in a room with the son of the family. And after she had been there less than a week, he raped her. Too humiliated to report the incident, she felt she had to bow to fate, and the family got themselves a bride, usually worth 1,000 yuan in that team, for free. My sister also told me how she had sneaked onto a boat to go back to Changsha during the first month, but was discovered by the Public Security Bureau and sent back again, and how she and her classmates had been robbed a number of times and finally caught a fellow educated youth. She told me how the peasants threw uncooked rice on their beds to keep away ghosts, and up on the roof in a strong wind so the grass wouldn't blow off. She described how they made poison by grinding up the dried bodies of insects and used it to revenge themselves on each other. But all of the stories she told me, the ones that made the deepest impression, were the ones about the conflicts between the peasants and the educated youths, because they were closest to my own experience. One night, when relations between the peasant and the educated youth contingent had deteriorated completely, 5 of the boys went to steal chickens in a nearby production team. They blundered in a dark kitchen and set up the chickens to screeching, waking everyone in the house. The old peasants sent up a horrible cry, and the neighbors came running. They beat the boys pretty severely, using sticks and fists and anything else they could lay their hands on. When they finally let them go, all 5 of the boys were bleeding. It was their hot-headed lack of experience that led them to take revenge the same night. They were only 15, no older than I was. They waited until well after midnight, when everything was quiet, and then stole back and surrounded one of the old peasants, where he lay in his bed. Who knows whether they had intended such violence, but they beat him around his head, and then pulled and twisted him until they had broken his leg. As a finishing touch, they overturned his furniture and broke dishes, pots, and anything else that would chatter. Then they ran, leaving him moaning in the ruins of his own home. Liang Weiping and her girl classmates were asleep in their house some distance from the boys' quarters when they were awakened by the angry hum of a revengeful mob. They made out the peasants dimly, maybe 30 of them, with hoes and sticks in their hands and coils of rope across their chests. The women and children brought up the rear. "Give us the murderers or we'll wash your house with blood," they yelled. It was the more terrifying because the girls had no idea what had happened. The crowd kicked at the boys' door as if to break it down. Liang Weiping was certain her friends would all be killed, for they were badly outnumbered, and even the production team leaders were in the mob. The girls made a desperate plan. With scissors, they cut their straw bedding and tied it onto the ends of some bamboo poles. Lighting their torches, they ran out at the peasants, shouting that if they didn't retreat, their straw roofs would burn and their houses be destroyed. The boys took courage from the girls and ran out into the flickering light, brandishing sticks and shouting their vilest Changsha curses. They managed to surround some of the peasants in front while the girls swung their torches. The crowd began to draw back. Maybe the reckless band of lower middle school graduates had succeeded in intimidating them, or maybe they feared the gods would be offended if more blood was spilled. In any case, what could have been a vicious battle was averted. By the light of the next day, more rational punishment was meted out. The whole group was forced to attend study class, and the 5 boys had to pay the medical expenses of the peasant they had victimized. The stealing went on as before, of course, but more cautiously and not so close to home. What I found most astonishing about all this was not the explosive scene Liang Weiping had described, for I had had many fights of my own with the peasant children. It was rather that my timid, conservative sister had engaged in such things, and bravely, and that she seemed to take her behavior for granted. She had her regrets, of course, as I did every time I fought or stole sweet potatoes. She told me never to tell father or Liang Fang, who had written saying that their old group's relationship with the peasants was excellent. How could Chairman Mao say that the countryside was a great land where we educated youths would have glorious successes? Liang Weiping pondered. "I'm only afraid that when I go back, I'll be sucked into the terrifying whirlpool once again."